Two Japanese battleships run in the outer screen of a carrier force that is already running out of carriers. Their silhouettes are wrong at a glance. Heavy forward turrets, thick armoured hulls, and then, aft, a flat deck where a battleship's stern should be. Catapults sit idle. The flight decks are there, but the aircraft that were meant to justify them are not. US carrier aircraft arrive in waves, diving through cloud breaks and lining up on the ships below. Ise and Hyuga answer like battleships, not carriers, turning to comb torpedoes, throwing up dense anti-aircraft fire, and firing specialized anti-aircraft shells from their main guns when the attack is close enough. They were rebuilt to solve a carrier crisis. Now they are fighting inside that crisis with empty decks, using their hybrid aviation gear as dead weight while their guns try to keep them alive. This is the strange story of Ise and Hyuga. Ise and Hyuga began as Ise-class dreadnought battleships of the First World War era, laid down in 1915 and completed in 1917 and 1918. As built, they displaced about 31,000 tons, measured 683 feet in overall length, and carried 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets. Their original machinery gave about 23 knots, adequate for the battle fleet doctrine they were designed to serve. Modernization in the 1930s reshaped them into taller, heavier, more capable ships. Pagoda masts, torpedo bulges, additional armor, and new machinery. After reconstruction, displacement rose to about 42,000, speed to about 25 knots by design. They were still not fast battleships in the late war American sense, but they were modernized enough to remain useful as fleet units, particularly as heavy escorts and as anti-aircraft platforms. The hybrid conversion, the reason they are remembered, was a solution to a different problem. After Midway, full conversions of battleships into fleet carriers were judged too slow and too expensive. The chosen compromise removed the rear pair of main turrets and build a short flight deck and hangar over the stern. Then add catapults to launch a small air group. This conversion kept the forward 4 14-inch turrets and most of the battleship armor scheme, but it changed the ship's purpose without changing its fundamental limits. Their new carrier deck was not a carrier deck in the operational sense. The flight deck was about 200 feet long, far too short for normal takeoff runs, and completely unsuitable for recoveries. Aircraft operations depended on 2 rotating catapults and cranes. The hangar and deck storage were linked by an aircraft lift and track and rail handling system. But sortie generation was inherently slow. The intended air group, catapult-launched Judy dive bombers modified for catapult launch, and Paul seaplanes for reconnaissance and recovery. The design itself acknowledged the flaw. Traditional carrier aircraft could be launched, but they could not return to the ship. The conversion also forced systemic trade-offs. Aviation petrol storage and ordnance handling were added to a hull designed for battleship magazines and armored gun supply, creating new vulnerability to fire and blast in spaces not originally laid out for carrier damage control. Anti-aircraft batteries were increased heavily, and radar fits expanded over time, turning Ise and Hyuga into dense flak platforms. But no amount of additional barrels could change the central fact that they could not operate their air group like true carriers, and they could not fight like true battleships once fuel and training shortages stripped away the ability to maneuver and coordinate at sea. By the eve of the Pacific War, Ise and Hyuga were already considered older units despite their reconstructions. They were present in the fleet order of battle, but not central to the carrier-led striking doctrine that defined early Japanese operations. Their early war activity reflects that status: distant cover and fleet presence rather than decisive roles in carrier strikes. At the opening of the Pacific War, they sortied as distant support for the Pearl Harbor strike, part of a heavy cover concept that assumed battleships might still matter as a strategic backstop, even as carrier aviation delivered the main blow. They also pursued, unsuccessfully, the American carrier force after the Doolittle raid. These were classic fleet battleship tasks: be present, threaten, and deter, even when the decisive combat was happening elsewhere. Then, in May 1942, both ships suffered incidents that would later matter in the conversion decision. Hyuga experienced a turret accident during gunnery practice that disabled turret number 5 and killed 51 crewmen. The aft magazines were flooded to contain the fire. Ise suffered flooding in her No. 2 engine room when a valve stuck open, forcing repairs. Around this period, prototype Type 21 radar sets appear in their story in connection with repairs and wartime modernization. These events did not cause the hybrid project by themselves. They contributed to the logic of selecting these specific hulls for drastic modification. In late May 1942, the sisters sailed with the Aleutian Support Group while the main Japanese carrier force moved toward Midway. They did not participate directly in the carrier battle, but they returned to a navy transformed by those hours in June. 4 fleet carriers were gone, and the entire concept of Japanese naval air power at sea was suddenly defined by absence of decks, aircraft, crews, and time. The story of Ise and Hyuga's strange transformation begins after Midway, when desperation becomes design. The conversion was not the first time anyone in Japan had imagined turning battleship hulls into carriers, but after Midway, it became an emergency measure instead of a theoretical one. More elaborate conversions were rejected as too slow. The compromise, remove aft turrets, add a short deck and catapults, was accepted because it could be done within wartime dockyard capacity and because it produced something that looked like aviation capability on paper. The selection was not arbitrary. Hyuga's turret No. 5 accident and the limitations of turret No. 6's elevation were cited as factors that made the class convenient candidates for losing their aft guns. In other words, the hybrids were not conceived from a clean design sheet. They were built around existing damage, limitations, and the urgent need to move faster than shipbuilding timelines allowed. The timeline shows the urgency and the limits. Ise's conversion ran from the 23rd of February to the 5th of September. Hyuga's ran from the 2nd of May to the 30th of November 1943. When Ise finished, she made trials and then moved cargo and troops to truck in October 1943, a reminder of how quickly Japanese warships were being repurposed into logistics tools as the perimeter strained. Hyuga completed later and joined the same broad pattern: workups, training, and waiting for an air group that was never fully realized at sea. What made the hybrids work, in theory, was the assumption that the air group would be present. In practice, the limiting factor was not just engineering, it was aircrew and aircraft availability. Training suffered from aircraft shortages, serviceability problems, and the growing drain of Japan's pilot pipeline. Even when aircraft were assigned on paper, the realities of fuel, maintenance, and pilot proficiency meant the ships could not reliably operate as aviation platforms. The hybrid concept became less an offensive tool and more a symbol of an aviation arm that could no longer meet fleet needs. By May 1944, the sisters were assigned to a reformed 4th Carrier Division, with an associated naval air group intended to operate the mixed seaplane and catapult-launched complement. On paper, the hybrid division was now a carrier formation. At sea, it was still 2 battleships with altered sterns and an air component that could not be safely counted on in combat conditions. In October 1944, the crisis reached its most revealing stage. Allied attacks in the Bonin Islands prompted Japanese orders for carrier forces to prepare for combat. Aircraft assigned to Ise and Hyuga, Judy and Paul types, were shifted into southern Kyushu and placed under broader air command. On October 14th, they attacked US carriers near Formosa with heavy losses and little effect. The key point for the hybrids is not that the raid failed. It is that, as the decisive fleet battle approached, the air component connected to the hybrids was already being used from land bases, not from the ships that had been rebuilt to carry it. Leyte Gulf, and specifically the battle off Cape Engano on October 25, 1944, marked the culmination of the hybrid story. The Japanese plan for the Philippines relied on a decoy carrier force to draw US fast carriers away from the landing area. Ozawa's northern force became that bait, and Ise and Hyuga were part of it. 2 hybrid battleship carriers sailing with fleet and light carriers that were themselves short of aircraft. The decoy force was real, but the air power behind it was thin. Aircraft were retained ashore for land-based strikes, and the ships that were supposed to represent carrier strength went into battle as hollow silhouettes. On the morning of October 25th, American carrier aircraft found Ozawa's force and attacked in repeated waves. Early strikes focused on the true carriers. The battle's brutality is visible in sequence. Carriers being hit, slowing, listing, and then being finished off, while the escorts maneuver under constant dive bombing. In among these actions, the hybrids functioned primarily as anti-aircraft escorts and as large maneuvering targets, throwing up flak, turning to avoid torpedoes, and trying to survive long enough to withdraw. Hyuga's battle narrative contains one of the most literal expressions of the hybrid's limitations. She took near-miss damage that ruptured hull plating in her bulge and caused list, damage that mattered operationally because it affected speed, stability, and the ability to hold formation under air attack. At one point, she was ordered to tow the crippled carrier Chiyoda, a task that failed under the pressure and pace of the air battle. This is what the hybrid reality looked like in combat, not launching strikes, but attempting rescues, towing, and survival tasks while the carrier force it protected was being destroyed. Ise's damage at Cape Engano is described in more than one way across records. One consolidated operational narrative describes heavy attack waves, multiple near misses, and a bomb hit outboard of a catapult area. A senior Japanese officer later described damage as limited but real, including near-miss blister perforations and a bomb effect near the port catapult mount, with an approximate casualty count in the 40 to 50 range for that incident. The reconciled conclusion is that Ise was damaged but not crippled, and that both hybrids survived the day and withdrew. After Cape Engano, the hybrid's operational life looks increasingly like desperation logistics. Catapults were removed from both ships in early November 1944, and they loaded troops and munitions. They were diverted based on air raid conditions, routed through the South China Sea, and moved between anchorages where fuel and air cover constraints dictated what was possible. Hyuga served as a flagship at times, but flagship in this context often meant a stationary command platform in a fleet that could no longer maneuver freely. The most revealing late-war operation involving Ise and Hyuga was Operation Kita in February 1945. It was not a battle. It was a run for survival and material. The two hybrids and an escort force were loaded in Singapore with aviation gasoline, standard gasoline, rubber, tin, and other metals, along with oil workers, then sent north toward Japan. Hyuga embarked 4,944 drums of aviation gasoline, 326 drums of standard gasoline, and 440 oilfield workers. Ise embarked 5,200 drums of aviation gasoline and 551 oil workers, plus large tonnages of rubber and tin. The escort included the light cruiser Oyodo and destroyers. Allied intelligence tracked the movement and positioned submarines to intercept. Multiple submarine torpedo attacks failed, and cloud cover frustrated air attack attempts, constrained by rules against radar-directed blind bombing in submarine-infested waters. The Japanese force reached Kure on February 20th, 1945. In strategic terms, it was one of the last times major Japanese warships returned from the southern resource area to the home islands. After that, the end is not ambiguous. Fuel shortages immobilized the remaining large IJN units, and Ise and Hyuga became floating anti-aircraft batteries in the Inland Sea region. In March 1945, Hyuga was hit by bombs during the strike on Kure and suffering casualties. By late July, repeated carrier raids struck the trapped fleet hard. Hyuga was hit by multiple bombs on the 24th of July and suffered severe casualties and progressive sinking in shallow water. Ise was also bombed repeatedly in late July, settling into shallow water. These were not dramatic open sea sinkings. They were executions of immobilized ships in harbors and bays where maneuver was no longer possible and where the air threat had become absolute. By mid-1945, Ise and Hyuga were immobilized, no longer warships capable of fleet action. Ise and Hyuga are remembered because their hybrid form captures Japan's mid-war crisis. The conversion was an attempt to solve a carrier deficit with hulls that already existed. It kept battleship armor and guns forward, but it grafted aviation onto an aft section that could never function like a real carrier. The deck was too short for landings, catapult tempo was limited, and recovery depended on seaplane water landings and crane handling. Even in a navy experienced with float planes, this was a slow, fragile cycle compared to true carrier sortie. The hybrids also reveal a deeper wartime trade-off. Design cannot compensate for pilot and aircraft shortages. Post-war testimony from the officer who commanded the division emphasizes that the conversion itself was seen as limited because the aircraft could not land back aboard, and that the ship's actual employment was constrained by insufficiently trained pilots and the diversion of aircraft to shore bases. In the moment Japan needed carriers, it often lacked the air groups to exploit them. Ise and Hyuga became a kind of visual bluff. Flight decks present, carrier capability assumed by outsiders, but operationally absent when combat arrived. Their operational record reinforces that verdict. In their most famous carrier moment, they decoyed by presence and fought primarily as anti-aircraft escorts, while the carrier force they sailed with was destroyed. Their most successful late-war mission was not aviation, but transport, Operation Kita, where their speed and survivability helped bring strategic materials home under intense interception effort. Their end, immobilized and bombed in shallow water, underlines the final truth for late-war Japan. Once fuel and air cover collapsed, even the strangest conversions could only delay the inevitable. The legacy is not that they were foolish ships. It is that they were honest ships, honest indicators of a navy trying to improvise its way out of a structural deficit in carriers, pilots, fuel, and time. A battleship hull can be cut and reshaped. A flight deck can be built. But naval aviation is a system. Without aircraft readiness, trained crews, and safe recovery, a hybrid becomes what Ise and Hyuga became. Battleships with compromised sterns, fighting and dying in a war whose decisive weight had already shifted permanently.